When the guns finally went silent in November 1918, the world was exhausted. For more than 4 long years, countries across Europe had fought one of the deadliest wars in human history, World War I. Cities were ruined, farmlands were destroyed, and millions of people had lost their loved ones. The war had changed everything, not only on the battlefields, but also in the minds and hearts of the people who survived. Let's take a calm walk through this time and understand what the world looked like right after that terrible war. Europe, once full of life and music and trade, was now a continent of ruins. Soldiers returned home, but many were not the same anymore. Some had lost their limbs, others their sight, and all had lost their peace of mind. Families waited at train stations for fathers and brothers who never came back. In some towns, almost every family had lost someone. The war had cost millions of lives. It wasn't just soldiers who died. Civilians, farmers, and children had suffered too. Villages were bombed and disease spread in the cold and dirty camps. When peace was finally declared, people wanted only one thing: to never, ever face such horror again. But peace didn't bring happiness. It brought confusion. Who was to blame for the war? Who would rebuild the broken towns? And how would countries pay for the enormous damage? In 1919, world leaders gathered in a grand palace near Paris called Versailles. Their goal was to create peace and make sure war would never happen again. But peace is not always made with kindness. Sometimes it is written with anger and punishment. The leaders of Britain and France believed that Germany, who had been on the losing side, should be punished harshly. They made Germany sign the Treaty of Versailles, a long document filled with strict rules and heavy penalties. Germany had to give up land to other countries, pay enormous amounts of money, called reparations, reduce its army to a small size, and accept full blame for causing the war. For the German people, this was humiliating. They didn't all agree with what their leaders had done during the war, but now they had to pay the price for it. Many Germans felt betrayed, not only by the foreign countries, but also by their own government, which had signed this painful treaty. The Treaty of Versailles was meant to bring peace, but instead it planted seeds of anger, revenge, and despair in Germany, seeds that would later grow into something dark and dangerous. After the war, most European countries were nearly bankrupt. They had spent all their money on weapons, food for soldiers, and rebuilding their armies. Factories that once made cars and clothes had been turned into war machine factories, and now they stood empty. In Germany, things were especially bad. The country had to pay billions in reparations to France and Britain, but it didn't have the money. So the German government tried to print more money. At first, it seemed like a solution, but soon the prices of things started rising and rising and rising. This was called hyperinflation. Imagine this. One day, a loaf of bread costs 1 mark. The next day, it costs 10, then 1,000, then 1,000,000. People carried money in baskets or suitcases, but it was almost worthless. Children made toys out of old banknotes because they were cheaper than wooden blocks. Salaries became meaningless. Pensioners couldn't buy food. People lost their life savings overnight. Many families went hungry even though they had piles of money, because that money could no longer buy anything. All over Europe, the economy was in ruins. Farmers had no tractors, factories had no materials, and shops had no customers. Unemployment grew, and with it came hopelessness. When people lose hope, they start looking for someone to blame. In the 1920s, that is exactly what happened in many European countries. Workers blamed businessmen blamed the government, and governments blamed each other. The world was full of arguments, protests, and strikes. New political ideas began to appear, ideas that promised strong leadership, quick solutions, and national pride. People were tired of weak governments and endless debates. They wanted someone who would make their countries great again, someone who would bring back jobs, food, and dignity. But sometimes when people are desperate, they turn to the wrong kind of leader. Leaders who don't bring peace, but power, fear, and control. After the war, Germany tried to build a new kind of government, a democracy. It was called the Weimar Republic, named after the city where it was formed. For the first time, Germans could vote freely. They had a president, a parliament, and new rights: freedom of speech, freedom to protest, and the right to choose their leaders. It sounded wonderful, but the Weimar Republic had a difficult start. There were too many political parties, and they often disagreed on everything. The economy was collapsing, and the German people, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, didn't fully trust democracy yet. On the streets, violence grew. Different groups, communists, nationalists, and right-wing militias fought each other, sometimes even in front of the police. In this chaos, some Germans began to believe that democracy was weak, that maybe what the country needed was a strong hand, not endless voting and arguing. That thought was dangerous. It was small at first, but it would grow into something that would shake the entire world. While Germany and Italy struggled, other countries were also facing problems. In Russia, a huge revolution had already taken place in 1917. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, had overthrown the old Russian Tsar and created the world's first communist government. It was a system that promised equality for all, but in practice it was strict and full of control. The rise of communism frightened many people in Europe. Wealthy families and business owners feared they might lose everything if communism spread to their countries. Ordinary people, on the other hand, were curious about it. They saw it as a possible solution to their hunger and poverty. So, two powerful ideas began to spread across Europe. On one side, communism, promising equality through revolution. On the other, nationalism and fascism, promising order through strength. Both sides wanted change, both sides criticized democracy, and both sides believed that only strong leadership could fix the broken world. Imagine living in Europe in the 1920s. Everywhere you look, things seem unstable. One day there's a new government, the next day it falls. One week prices are low, the next they're impossible. There are protests, strikes, and riots. People feel lost and unsafe. In these uncertain times, some leaders began to use fear to gain power. They told their people, "You are poor because of the foreigners. Your country is weak because of traitors. If you give me power, I will make you proud again." And many people believed them, not because they were bad, but because they were desperate for hope. Before World War I, politics had mostly been about kings, queens, and parliaments. After the war, something new appeared: mass politics. Newspapers, posters, radio broadcasts, and rallies became powerful tools to reach millions of people. Leaders began to realize that if they could influence the hearts and minds of ordinary people, they could control nations without needing a crown. They started organizing huge public meetings, using symbols, songs, and uniforms to make people feel united. It wasn't just politics anymore. It was emotion, theater, and identity. This new kind of politics would soon give birth to movements like fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, movements that changed how power looked and felt. By the late 1920s, some parts of Europe began to recover. Factories reopened and trade slowly returned. But then something terrible happened far away, in the United States. In 1929, the New York stock market crashed. It was called the Great Depression. Banks failed, businesses closed, millions lost their jobs. And because the world's economies were connected, the disaster quickly spread to Europe. Countries that were just beginning to stand up fell down again. Germany was hit hardest. Unemployment reached record levels, millions without work, food, or homes. Families sold their furniture, their jewelry, even their clothes, just to survive. The sense of humiliation returned, deeper than before. And once again, the people began searching for someone who could rescue them. That someone would soon appear with promises of pride, jobs, and revenge. So, by the early 1930s, Europe was a continent full of wounds. Economic wounds from debt and hunger, political wounds from weak governments, emotional wounds from fear and shame. And in this fragile time, dangerous ideas began to grow. Ideas that said democracy was too slow. Ideas that said freedom was a luxury. Ideas that said only power could bring peace. From these ideas rose two of the most frightening movements in history: Fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. They would rise like storms, fueled by fear and pride, and their leaders would promise light, but bring only darkness. At the end of the 1920s, the world was standing on a thin bridge between peace and chaos. The wounds of World War I had never truly healed. People had lost trust in governments, in money, and even in one another. And when hope disappears, anything, even the wrong thing, can look like salvation. As we move to the next chapter, we'll travel to Italy, the birthplace of fascism, and see how one man named Benito Mussolini turned fear into power, and how his ideas inspired others across Europe to follow a dangerous path. When World War I ended, Italy was supposed to feel proud. It had fought on the winning side, alongside Britain and France. But instead of celebration, there was disappointment, anger, and confusion. People called it a mutilated victory. Let's slowly understand what that means and how it gave birth to a new and dangerous idea called fascism. Italy had joined the war in 1915 after being promised new lands if it helped defeat Germany and Austria-Hungary. When the fighting stopped in 1918, Italy expected to be rewarded. But at the peace talks in Versailles, the Italian leaders were ignored. They received only small pieces of land and none of the colonies they had dreamed about. The Italian people felt betrayed. Soldiers came home from the front with medals, but no jobs. Factories that had worked day and night during the war closed. Prices rose. Food was scarce. Families were hungry. Many asked, why did we fight at all? That disappointment became fertile soil for anger. And anger is often the first seed of extremism. Between 1919 and 1921, Italy seemed to fall apart. There were strikes in the factories, protests in the streets, and even small revolts in the countryside. Farmers seized land from wealthy owners. Workers took over factories and tried to run them on their own. It looked as if a revolution, like the one in Russia, might soon happen in Italy too. The government in Rome was weak. Prime ministers changed almost every few months. Each new leader promised stability, but none could deliver it. For ordinary Italians, democracy began to look useless. They didn't care about speeches or votes anymore. They wanted action, strength, and order. And in the middle of this confusion, one man saw an opportunity. Benito Mussolini was born in 1883 in a small Italian village. His father was a blacksmith with socialist ideas, and his mother was a schoolteacher. As a young man, Mussolini was intelligent, bold, and full of restless energy. He loved attention and dreamed of greatness. Before the war, he had worked as a journalist and supported socialism, the belief that workers should control the government. But his beliefs changed when the war began. He thought Italy needed strength, not class struggle. He believed that the country's problems could be solved only by national unity and by force, if necessary. In 1919, Mussolini founded a political movement he called Fasci di Combattimento, which means Leagues of Combat. The word fascism came from the ancient Roman word fasces, a bundle of rods tied around an X. It was a symbol of power and unity. Many sticks bound together are strong, but a single stick breaks easily. Mussolini used this symbol to say, "Together, under one leader, Italy will be strong again." At first, very few people paid attention to Mussolini, but his speeches were fiery and passionate. He shouted about national pride, about discipline, about bringing back the glory of ancient Rome. He told Italians that democracy was weak, that Italy needed one voice, one flag, and one destiny. His followers began to grow. They wore black shirts and marched in rows. People called them the Black Shirts. They attacked communist meetings, broke strikes, and beat up anyone who disagreed with them. In towns where chaos ruled, the fascists brought quick order through fear and violence. To some Italians, that seemed better than endless disorder. Businessmen liked Mussolini because he promised to stop worker strikes. Landowners liked him because he would protect their property from peasants. And many ordinary citizens liked him because he made them feel proud to be Italian again. Mussolini was not just a politician, he was a master of image. He posed as a strong, confident man, jaw lifted, chest out, eyes fierce. He wanted people to see him as the new Caesar, the man who would rebuild the Roman Empire. He used newspapers, posters, and rallies to spread his message. Crowds gathered to hear him shout, "Believe, obey, fight." Children learned songs praising him. Posters showed him driving tractors, riding horses, flying planes, as if there was nothing he couldn't do. He wanted to be seen not just as a leader, but as Il Duce, the leader. Fascism taught that the nation was more important than any individual. Obedience was more valuable than freedom. Strength was proof of greatness, and that those who questioned authority were enemies of the state. These ideas slowly replaced democracy, kindness, and open debate. They sounded simple and strong, and that's why they spread so easily. By 1922, Mussolini and his black shirts had grown powerful. They controlled parts of the countryside and influenced newspapers and police. The Italian government was collapsing again, and the king, Victor Emmanuel III, was desperate to avoid civil war. Mussolini saw his chance. He announced a massive protest, the March to Rome. Thousands of fascists, dressed in black, marched toward the capital. They wanted to show that they were ready to take power by force. But before any battle began, something unexpected happened. The king refused to use the army against them. He feared bloodshed. Instead, he invited Mussolini to form a government. On October 29, 1922, Mussolini arrived in Rome by train, not as a conqueror, but as Italy's new prime minister. He was only 39 years old. At first, Mussolini ruled legally within the old constitution, but step by step, he changed everything. He passed new laws that gave him more control over the police, the press, and the parliament. He banned other political parties. He created a secret police to arrest or silence his opponents. Gradually, Italy stopped being a democracy and became a dictatorship. By 1925, Mussolini declared himself Il Duce, the leader. He said he spoke for all Italians and that anyone who disagreed was against Italy itself. The parliament no longer mattered. The courts obeyed him. Newspapers printed only what he approved. Even children at school were taught to salute his portrait and memorize his slogans. Mussolini promised to make Italy strong, rich, and respected again. He began massive building projects, roads, bridges, and stadiums. He drained swamps, increased farming, and created jobs for many. For a while, things looked better. Unemployment dropped, and people began to believe the fascist dream. But beneath the surface, freedom was dying. Trade unions were abolished. People couldn't speak openly. Those who criticized the government disappeared into prisons or were sent into exile. Fear became part of everyday life. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Children were taught that the state came before their parents. Posters said, "Mussolini is always right." The fascist system demanded loyalty, not love. And yet millions obeyed. Mussolini believed in strength above all. He admired ancient Rome and wanted Italians to think of themselves as modern Romans, tough, disciplined, and brave. He wanted boys to grow up as soldiers and girls to grow up as mothers of soldiers. He created youth groups that trained children to march, salute, and chant slogans. Propaganda films showed Il Duce inspecting troops or flying airplanes. He made himself appear almost superhuman. He once said, "Better to live one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep." It was a powerful phrase, but it also encouraged aggression. It taught people that war and dominance were signs of greatness. Mussolini's dreams grew bigger. He wanted an Italian empire, like Rome had long ago. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent nations in Africa. His army used modern weapons against soldiers on horseback. It was a brutal war. The world protested, but Mussolini didn't care. He said Italy needed colonies for its people and pride for its flag. When the League of Nations tried to punish Italy with trade bans, he ignored them. The world's inaction only made him bolder. His success in Ethiopia made him a hero at home, at least for a while. Crowds cheered him. Parades celebrated the new Roman Empire. But it also made him look like a model for other leaders who admired power more than peace. One of those admirers lived in Germany. His name was Adolf Hitler. To understand why Mussolini's ideas spread, let's look at the heart of fascism in simple terms. Nation above all. The country is everything. The individual is nothing. One leader. A strong leader is better than many weak politicians. Obedience. Citizens must follow orders without question. Control. The state should control the economy, the schools, and the media. Glory through war. Peace makes people soft. War makes them proud. Fear of enemies. Enemies, real or imagined, unite the people under the leader. These ideas might sound powerful, but they remove freedom, kindness, and reason. They turn citizens into followers and followers into tools. It's easy to wonder why Italians didn't resist, but remember the times. They had seen poverty, hunger, chaos, and endless political fights. Mussolini gave them a sense of pride, order, and purpose. He built roads, made trains run on time, and gave the feeling that someone finally had control. Many believed his rule was a fair trade, freedom for stability. But soon they realized that when one man controls everything, even stability can become a prison. By the late 1920s, Mussolini's success inspired others across Europe. Movements calling themselves fascist or nationalist appeared in Spain, Hungary, and even in France. They admired the order, the unity, and the power Mussolini seemed to have. And in Germany, a man watched closely, learning from Mussolini's every move, how to use propaganda, how to turn chaos into loyalty, and how to promise greatness to a wounded nation. That man was Adolf Hitler. He saw in Mussolini a blueprint for his own rise, one that would soon lead the world toward its darkest chapter. By the early 1930s, Italy under Mussolini looked disciplined and proud on the outside. Marches, uniforms, speeches. But inside, the country was tired and fearful. Factories still struggled, and wages stayed low. The rich grew richer, and the poor stayed poor. But no one dared to complain. The newspapers said Italy was stronger than ever, but the truth was that the people's voices had vanished. Dictatorships often look powerful until you realize that silence is not peace, it's fear. Fascism was born out of disappointment, fear, and the longing for strength. It promised pride, but demanded obedience. It built order, but destroyed freedom. And it created a pattern that others would soon copy, especially in Germany. As we move into the next chapter, we will travel north to a country broken by defeat, haunted by humiliation, and desperate for hope. There, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler would turn pain into power and give the world something even darker than fascism: Nazism. When World War I ended in 1918, Germany was broken, not just on the battlefield, but in spirit. The proud empire that had once been ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II was gone. The country's cities were in ruins, its people were starving, and its leaders were forced to sign one of the harshest peace treaties in history, the Treaty of Versailles. To understand how Nazism began, we have to look carefully at how this defeat changed the hearts and minds of ordinary Germans. In June 1919, German representatives were brought to the Palace of Versailles to sign the peace treaty. They were not allowed to discuss or change its terms, only to accept them. It was a moment of deep humiliation. The treaty said that Germany alone was responsible for starting the war. It took away 13% of German land, all of its colonies, and parts of its richest industrial regions. It limited the German army to just 100,000 soldiers, banned tanks and aircraft, and demanded enormous reparations, payments that would take decades to fulfill. For many Germans, this felt like a national insult. They didn't see themselves as the only ones to blame. Millions believed that the politicians who signed the treaty had betrayed the army, stabbing it in the back while brave soldiers were still fighting at the front. This myth, called the stab in the back legend, would later become a powerful weapon for those who wanted revenge. After the Kaiser fled into exile, Germany tried something new: democracy. In 1919, a new government was formed in the city of Weimar, and so it became known as the Weimar Republic. It promised freedom of speech, voting rights for both men and women, and a new beginning. But it was born in chaos. The economy was in ruins. Soldiers returned home to no jobs. Communists and right-wing nationalists fought in the streets, and every group blamed the other for Germany's suffering. In the early years of the Weimar Republic, inflation destroyed the value of money. People needed wheelbarrows full of banknotes just to buy a loaf of bread. Savings disappeared overnight. Children made kites out of worthless paper marks. Old men cried as their life savings could no longer buy even a meal. It was not just economic pain. It was emotional pain. People lost trust in their government, in their future, and in themselves. When life becomes unbearable, people often look for simple answers to complex problems. They search for someone to blame and for someone who promises to fix everything quickly. In Germany, that led to the rise of extreme political groups. On one side were the communists, inspired by the Russian Revolution. They wanted to abolish private property and create a workers' state. On the other side were the nationalists, who dreamed of bringing back the old empire's glory and punishing those who had betrayed Germany. The democratic government stood in the middle, weak, unpopular. It couldn't satisfy anyone. People saw it as the government of defeat, of shame, of endless arguments. And in that storm of anger and confusion, a small new party began to appear, one that called itself the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or simply The Nazi Party. At first, it was tiny and unknown, but soon one man would make it famous across the world. Adolf Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. He grew up with dreams of becoming an artist, but he was rejected from art school in Vienna. He lived in poverty for years, selling postcards and painting small pictures to survive. When World War I broke out, Hitler volunteered for the German army. He brought bravely and was wounded in battle. When the war ended, he was recovering in a hospital. And when he heard that Germany had surrendered, he felt broken and betrayed. He later said that day was the worst moment of his life. After the war, he returned to Munich, a city full of protests, hunger, and chaos. He joined a small nationalist group that believed Germany had been ruined by traitors, communists, and Jews. That group would soon become the Nazi Party, and Hitler quickly became its most powerful voice. Hitler was not a soldier anymore, and he was not an artist, but he had something else: the power of words. He could speak with fire. He shouted, paused, and gestured in ways that made people feel his anger as if it were their own. In smoky beer halls of Munich, people gathered to listen. They were tired, angry, and hopeless, and here was a man who spoke their feelings out loud. He told them, "Germany was betrayed. We are victims, not villains. I will make Germany proud again." He promised to rebuild the army, end unemployment, destroy communism, and tear up the Treaty of Versailles. And he gave them someone to blame: the Jews, whom he falsely accused of controlling money, media, and politics.
This was the birth of Nazi ideology, a poisonous mix of nationalism, racism, and revenge. The Nazi Party's ideas sounded simple, and that's why they were dangerous. They claimed to stand for national pride and unity, a strong leader instead of weak politicians, jobs and food for all Germans, hatred of Jews and communists, and the belief that Germans were a superior race. Hitler called this superior group the Aryan race. He said they were destined to rule over others, and that anyone who stood in their way was an enemy. Many people disagreed, but many others, desperate for hope, began to believe him. In 1923, Hitler decided that speeches were not enough. He wanted power immediately. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, he planned his own uprising, a March on Berlin. It began in a Munich beer hall where he declared a revolution. But it failed. The police fired on the marchers. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested and sent to prison. At first, it seemed like the end of his movement. But prison gave Hitler time, and time gave him clarity. In his cell, Hitler began writing a book called Mein Kampf, My Struggle. It was part autobiography, part political plan, and part hate-filled manifesto. In it, he wrote about his dreams for Germany, to rebuild its strength, conquer new lands, and remove those he saw as unworthy. He described his hatred for Jews, his belief in racial purity, and his vision of a Germany united under one leader, himself. The book became the Bible of the Nazi movement. Few people read it seriously at the time, but later, its words would become actions, deadly actions. After Hitler left prison, Germany entered a brief period of recovery. Foreign loans helped rebuild the economy. For a few years, life improved. But in 1929, disaster struck again: the Great Depression. The stock market crashed in America, and soon banks in Germany began to fail. Factories closed, trade stopped, and millions of people lost their jobs. In 1932, over 6 million Germans were unemployed. Families went hungry again, and children begged on the streets. And the people's anger returned, stronger than ever. This time, Hitler was ready. He promised to bring back work, dignity, and national pride. He said democracy had failed and only a strong hand could save Germany. His speeches filled stadiums. Posters showed him as a savior, a man of destiny. The Nazi flag, red with a white circle and a black swastika, became a symbol of power and unity. By 1932, the Nazi Party had become the largest in Germany. They didn't have a majority, but they were strong enough to shake the system. That year, Hitler ran for president against Paul von Hindenburg, an old war hero. He lost, but he gained millions of votes, proving his popularity. Behind the scenes, powerful businessmen and conservative politicians began to see Hitler as useful. They thought they could control him, that his speeches could attract the crowds while they made the real decisions. They were wrong. In January 1933, Hindenburg, under pressure, appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany, the head of government. It was a legal move, made through democratic rules, but it would be the last free decision the German parliament ever made. Just weeks after Hitler became Chancellor, a fire broke out in the Reichstag, Germany's parliament building. The Nazis blamed the communists and claimed it was part of a plan to destroy Germany. Using this fear, Hitler convinced Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended basic rights. People could now be arrested without trial. Newspapers could be censored. Political opponents could be silenced. It was the end of freedom and the beginning of dictatorship. In March 1933, new elections were held. The Nazis used intimidation, propaganda, and violence to win. They passed the Enabling Act, which gave Hitler full control to make laws without parliament. Democracy was gone. The Weimar Republic, Germany's experiment with freedom, was over. From then on, Hitler ruled as Führer, meaning leader. He banned all other political parties, closed independent newspapers, and created secret police, the Gestapo, to hunt down anyone who opposed him. The seeds of Nazism had fully grown into a regime. Under Nazi rule, Hitler became more than a leader. He became a symbol. Posters showed him as Germany's savior. Children were taught to love him more than their parents. People greeted each other with the Nazi salute, shouting Heil Hitler, which means hail the leader. Radio, movies, and newspapers repeated his words daily. He promised to restore jobs, rebuild the army, and bring back national pride. And he did, but at a terrible cost. Germany began building weapons in secret. Roads, factories, and military programs created jobs. Unemployment fell, and many people started to believe the nightmare years were finally over. But behind the smiles and parades, dark things were happening. The Nazis began to pass laws that targeted Jews. Jewish teachers, doctors, and lawyers lost their jobs. Jewish-owned shops were boycotted. Books written by Jewish authors were burned in public squares. Children were taught that Jews were different and inferior. This was the start of what would become one of history's greatest horrors, but at the time, many Germans looked away. They were too busy celebrating their new jobs and their nation's recovery. Germany's journey from defeat to dictatorship did not happen overnight. It began with pain, the humiliation of war, the suffering of poverty, and the confusion of democracy. It grew through fear of communism, fear of hunger, fear of chaos. And it blossomed in anger that was carefully guided and shaped by one man with dangerous ideas. The seeds of Nazism were planted in the soil of despair, and when the Great Depression came, those seeds found the perfect storm to grow. As we move into the next chapter, we will see how Adolf Hitler, now in power, transformed Germany into a totalitarian state, and how his rule turned propaganda into faith, fear into loyalty, and lies into law.
When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, Few could imagine how quickly the country would change. Within months, democracy vanished. Within a few years, one man held absolute power over a nation of more than 60 million people. This chapter is the story of how Hitler, through careful planning, manipulation, and fear, turned Germany into a totalitarian state, and how millions of ordinary people helped him do it, often without realizing what they were becoming part of. The day Hitler became chancellor, Berlin was covered in winter fog. The streets were quiet, but behind the scenes, something enormous was beginning. The Nazi Party celebrated as if victory had already been achieved, but technically, Hitler still shared power with other politicians. He did not intend to share it for long. Just a few weeks later, on February 27, 1933, the German parliament building, the Reichstag, was set on fire. Flames rose high into the night sky. The Nazis blamed the communists, claiming it was the start of a revolution. In truth, the cause of the fire remains uncertain even today. But Hitler used it perfectly to his advantage. He convinced President Hindenburg to sign a special law, the Reichstag Fire Decree. This decree suspended all civil rights in Germany. People could now be arrested without a reason. Police could search homes without warrants. Free speech, free press, and free assembly all were gone overnight. It was the first big step toward dictatorship. In March 1933, new elections were held, but they were far from fair. Nazi supporters marched through towns carrying torches, chanting, "One people, one nation, one leader." Opposition newspapers were closed, and thousands of communists were jailed. Once inside Parliament, Hitler demanded a new law, the Enabling Act, which would give him the power to make laws without Parliament's approval. He claimed it was necessary to save Germany from chaos. Many were afraid to oppose him. The Nazi stormtroopers surrounded the building during the vote. With threats and pressure, the act passed. It was the moment Germany's democracy officially ended. Hitler no longer needed permission from anyone. He could rule by decree, meaning his word was now law. Once he had legal power, Hitler began removing anyone who could challenge him. Other political parties were banned. The Social Democrats and Communists were outlawed. Trade unions, groups that protected workers' rights, were dissolved. Their leaders were arrested, beaten, or sent to prison camps. By the end of 1933, there was only one party left in Germany, the Nazi Party. Hitler called this new order Gleichschaltung, which means coordination, the process of making every part of life march in step with Nazi ideas. Every local government, school, newspaper, and club was brought under Nazi control. If you were not loyal to the party, you were quietly removed from your job, or worse. Fear had now entered every German home. In 1934, President Hindenburg, the old war hero who had once been Germany's highest authority, died at age 86. Hitler saw another opportunity. Instead of choosing a new president, he merged the roles of chancellor and president, giving himself a new title, Führer, meaning leader. Now there was no one above him. He was both head of government and head of state. The army swore a personal oath of loyalty to him, not to the nation or the Constitution, but to Adolf Hitler himself. From that day forward, Germany was his. Even within his own ranks, Hitler feared threats. The Nazi stormtroopers, called the SA, had helped him rise to power, but their leader, Ernst Röhm, wanted more influence. Röhm dreamed of replacing the regular army with his own men. Hitler couldn't allow that. He needed the army's support. So, in June 1934, he ordered a secret operation. Over several nights, Nazi officers hunted down Röhm and other SA leaders. They were arrested and executed without trial. Hitler later told the nation he had saved Germany from a plot, and many believed him. Fear had now become his most powerful tool, and even those who once supported him now obeyed him without question. By 1935, Hitler had total control. But power alone was not enough. He needed the German people to love him, or at least to appear as if they did. To achieve that, he built a state based on propaganda and terror. He created two powerful tools: the Ministry of Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, and the Gestapo, the secret police. Goebbels controlled all media: newspapers, radio, films, and art. Only Nazi-approved content was allowed. He filled Germany with posters of smiling soldiers, hardworking farmers, and happy families, all under Hitler's watchful gaze. Every movie, song, and schoolbook carried the same message: Germany is strong again. Hitler is our savior. Obedience is freedom. At the same time, the Gestapo made sure no one dared to disagree. They listened, watched, and reported. Even a careless joke about the Führer could lead to arrest. This combination of love and fear made the regime unshakable. Hitler understood something very important. If you want to control the future, you must control the children. He created the Hitler Youth for boys and the League of German Girls for girls. Membership soon became mandatory. Boys learned to march, salute, and shoot. They were taught that strength, bravery, and loyalty to Hitler were the highest virtues. Girls were taught that their duty was to stay pure, obey, and one day become mothers of strong German sons. Schools changed their lessons too. History books were rewritten to glorify Germany's past. Science classes taught ideas about racial purity. Teachers who disagreed were fired. The goal was simple: raise a generation that would never question the Nazi worldview. The Nazis understood the power of art, music, and architecture. They used them to send messages of strength and unity. Large rallies were held with banners, marching bands, and torches lighting the night. The most famous of these took place in Nuremberg, where hundreds of thousands gathered to chant Heil Hitler in perfect rhythm. Cameras captured every angle, and films turned these rallies into emotional spectacles seen across the country. Hitler wanted everything in Germany to reflect his idea of perfection: tall buildings, grand sculptures, and clean streets. But beneath the surface, there was fear, silence, and the loss of freedom. Under the Nazis, women's roles changed drastically. They were told their place was at home, as wives and mothers. The government gave awards to women who had many children, calling them mothers of the nation. Girls were taught that their greatest honor was to give birth to the next generation of pure Germans. Education for women was limited, and many were forced to leave their jobs. This idea of control over both thought and body was central to Nazi belief. While controlling people's lives, Hitler also began rebuilding Germany's economy. He started massive public works projects, highways, bridges, and factories. One of his proudest achievements was the construction of the Autobahn, a network of high-speed roads. He also expanded the military, even though it was forbidden by the Treaty of Versailles. He reopened arms factories and secretly trained pilots and soldiers. Millions of jobs were created, and soon unemployment fell dramatically. To many Germans, it looked like a miracle. They had gone from poverty to stability. They had jobs, food, and national pride again. Few cared how it was achieved or what it might lead to. This was Hitler's greatest success, convincing the people that his dictatorship was saving them, when in fact it was preparing them for war. In 1935, the Nazis passed the Nuremberg Laws, which officially divided German society along racial lines. These laws said Jews were no longer citizens of Germany. They could not marry or have relations with Aryans. They could not vote, hold government jobs, or attend certain schools. Jews were publicly humiliated, businesses were boycotted, and neighbors began to turn against them. This was not just prejudice, it was government policy. Hatred had become law. Hitler claimed he was protecting the purity of the German race. In truth, he was turning ordinary people into instruments of cruelty. To enforce all this, Hitler relied on terror. The Gestapo, or secret police, could arrest anyone at any time. People disappeared in the night, never to be seen again. Whispers of resistance were crushed before they could spread. The first concentration camps were built, places like Dachau, originally to imprison political opponents. But soon they would hold Jews, homosexuals, Romani people, and anyone the regime considered undesirable. These camps were not yet the death factories of later years, but they were places of horror, beatings, starvation, and fear. The message was clear: obey or vanish. Hitler's government constantly glorified war. Children played with toy soldiers. Textbooks spoke of sacrifice and conquest. Posters showed strong men and heroic battles. He believed that war was natural, that it made nations great. Peace, he said, was weakless. And so, in every speech, every parade, every classroom, the idea was repeated: Germany must rise again. Germany must reclaim what was lost. Germany must conquer its destiny. By 1936, that dream began to take shape, and the world began to tremble. In 1936, Germany hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin. It was a chance for Hitler to show the world his new Germany, organized, clean, and powerful. The streets were decorated with flags. Stadiums were filled with cheering crowds, and foreign visitors were treated kindly. For a few weeks, the world saw a smiling face, not the brutality behind it. The Nazis even removed anti-Jewish signs during the games to avoid criticism. It was all a performance, and it worked. Many visitors returned home saying Germany seemed peaceful and strong. But once the spotlight faded, persecution resumed even harder than before. On November 9, 1938, an event shocked the world. After a young Jewish boy shot a German diplomat in Paris, Nazi leaders used it as an excuse for nationwide violence. Mobs attacked Jewish homes, shops, and synagogues. Windows were smashed, fires burned through the night, and police stood by, doing nothing. It became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Over 90 Jews were killed, and thousands were arrested. Their businesses were destroyed. This was the moment when persecution turned into open terror. Still, most nations stayed silent. By the late 1930s, Hitler had achieved what once seemed impossible. He had rebuilt a broken nation, revived its pride, and created a terrifying unity built on obedience and fear. The Nazi Party was not just a political organization anymore, it was a way of life. But the peace Germany enjoyed was built on lies, hatred, and weapons. Hitler's speeches grew more ambitious. He spoke of reclaiming lost lands, uniting all Germans, and destroying enemies who stood in his way. The world was watching, but not acting. And soon his ambitions would move beyond Germany's borders, setting the stage for the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. By the mid-1930s, much of Europe had fallen under the shadow of powerful dictators. In Italy, Benito Mussolini ruled as Il Duce. In Germany, Adolf Hitler reigned as Führer. Both promised glory, order, and pride, and both demanded obedience, silence, and sacrifice. But what was it like to actually live in these societies, to wake up each morning under their rule? Let's walk through that world step by step and see how millions of ordinary people came to accept a life of control, propaganda, and fear. Under fascism and Nazism, life was not private anymore. The government reached into every part of a person's life, what they read, what they said, even what they thought. In Italy and Germany, newspapers printed only what the state allowed. Every headline, every photograph, and every story was chosen carefully to make the leaders look wise, strong, and heroic. Posters hung on every street corner, smiling workers, brave soldiers, happy mothers. And always, somewhere in the picture, was the face of the leader, watching. At first, many people didn't notice the control. The news still spoke of progress, jobs, and pride. But slowly, independent voices began to disappear. Journalists who questioned the government were fired, jailed, or even killed. Radio stations were nationalized, movies were censored, and plays were rewritten to praise the leader. The message was simple. The leader is always right. The nation is everything. Obedience brings peace. And so, people stopped asking questions. Propaganda is a powerful tool. It doesn't force people with violence. It convinces them with emotion. Both Mussolini and Hitler understood this better than anyone. They knew that if you repeat something enough, people begin to believe it. They didn't just want to control actions, they wanted to control minds. In Germany, Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda, turned media into a weapon. He once said, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it." He flooded the country with slogans, films, and speeches that praised Hitler as Germany's savior. Posters showed Hitler surrounded by light, like a saint. Children were taught that he loved them more than their parents. Every film, every radio broadcast, every newspaper carried his voice, his words, his image. In Italy, Mussolini used newspapers and cinema in the same way. He built a myth around himself, Il Duce, the man who made the trains run on time, the man who revived Rome's greatness. Public speeches were carefully staged. Cameras always caught him standing tall, looking powerful, with cheering crowds in the background. Propaganda made dictators look like heroes. And when you make people believe their leader is a hero, they stop seeing him as a human and start seeing him as destiny. Behind all the posters and parades, there was another force, silent but everywhere. In Germany, it was the Gestapo, the secret state police. In Italy, it was the OVRA, Mussolini's secret police. Their job was not just to catch criminals, it was to control thought. They listened, spied, and reported. People never knew who might be listening: a neighbor, a colleague, even a friend. Children were encouraged to report parents who criticized the government. Teachers had to report students who showed disloyalty. A careless joke, a whispered complaint, or even a sigh could be dangerous. If you were suspected, you could be taken away in the night, without warning, without trial. Families would wake up to find someone missing, and no one would dare ask why. This created what historians call the culture of fear. People didn't obey because they loved the regime. They obeyed because they were afraid not to. For ordinary Germans, life under Hitler depended on who you were. If you were a healthy, Aryan German who followed the rules, you could have a decent life. You might get a job building roads or working in a factory. You could join parades, youth groups, and holiday camps. The government offered cheap vacations, cars, and community programs, all part of a movement called Strength Through Joy. On the surface, it looked like happiness. but everything you did was designed to serve the state. Workplaces began with Nazi salutes. Songs praised Hitler. Even weddings and school plays included party slogans. People learned to smile for the cameras and stay silent in private. For Jews, life was completely different. Their shops were vandalized. Their children were bullied in school. Doctors, teachers, and artists lost their jobs. Signs outside towns read, "Jews not wanted here." The humiliation was endless, and it was legal. In Mussolini's Italy, the atmosphere was slightly different, less violent at first, but still oppressive. The regime wanted to create a nation of strong men and obedient women. Men were expected to join the army or work for the state. Women were told their duty was to stay home, cook, and raise large families. The government gave nettles to mothers who had many children. Education was filled with fascist symbols. Children wore black uniforms, marched in squares, and sang songs praising Il Duce. Textbooks taught that Mussolini was brave, wise, and nearly perfect. Dissent, any form of disagreement, was not tolerated. Writers who criticized the regime were exiled or silenced. People who spoke freely vanished into prisons or remote villages. And yet, in the streets of Rome or Milan, you would see posters of smiling faces, flags waving, and slogans like, "Believe, obey, fight." It was a strange world, joyful on the outside, fearful within. Both dictators knew that to control the future, they had to control the young. In Germany, the Hitler Youth became one of the most powerful tools of indoctrination. By the late 1930s, it had millions of members. Boys trained with rifles, learned to march, and swore oaths of loyalty to Hitler. Girls joined the League of German Girls, learning cooking, nursing, and the honor of motherhood. They were taught that their parents' generation had failed, that the future belonged to them, the children of the Reich. And they believed it. In Italy, the Balilla Youth Organization did the same. Children as young as 8 wore uniforms, carried toy guns, and learned that war was noble and peace was cowardice. They practiced discipline, teamwork, and obedience, not freedom or curiosity. When children grow up believing authority is sacred, they don't question it as adults. That was the dictator's greatest success. Art has the power to inspire, and dictators fear what they can't control. In Nazi Germany, artists had to join the Reich Chamber of Culture. Writers, painters, and musicians who refused were banned from working. Books by Jewish or un-German authors were burned in public ceremonies. Modern art was called degenerate. Jazz music was forbidden because it was seen as foreign. Only art that glorified the state, the army, or traditional German life was allowed. Statues showed strong men and pure women. Paintings showed happy farmers and soldiers. Every piece of art was a mirror reflecting Nazi ideals. In Italy, Mussolini encouraged architecture and art that reminded people of the Roman Empire, grand, stony, and symmetrical. Buildings were designed to look eternal, to make people feel small in front of the state. By shaping beauty itself, dictators shaped how people thought about strength, pride, and obedience. Religion was another area of control. Hitler made agreements with churches, promising to respect their freedom, but only as long as they didn't criticize him. Priests who spoke out were arrested or sent to concentration camps. In Italy, Mussolini made peace with the Pope through the Lateran Treaty in 1929. It gave the Vatican independence, but it also gave Mussolini the Church's support for a while. The Church was used to teach children that obeying the state was like obeying God. Both leaders knew if you can turn faith toward the state, you can make people believe obedience is sacred. The Nazis and fascists understood that emotion is stronger than reason, so they filled the year with parades, speeches, and festivals. In Germany, there were massive rallies in Nuremberg, carefully staged with torches, flags, and music. Thousands marched in perfect lines, saluting the Führer as planes flew overhead. At night, lights and fire made it look like heaven on earth. In Italy, Mussolini stood on balconies, waving to cheering crowds. He shouted promises of empire and victory, and the people roared back in unison. These events gave people a sense of belonging, of being part of something greater than themselves. But that unity was built on illusion. They were cheering not for peace or prosperity, but for control. Not everyone believed the propaganda. There were brave men and women who tried to resist. Some wrote secret leaflets, smuggled information, or helped persecuted people hide. Priests preached kindness instead of hate. Teachers quietly told their students the truth. But resistance was dangerous. Most who were caught were imprisoned, tortured, or killed. So most people stayed silent. Some convinced themselves that things weren't that bad. Others thought it was safer to look away. And so, little by little, silence became the strongest support for dictatorship. By the late 1930s, Germany and Italy seemed stable. There were no protests, no visible opposition, no hunger. Factories were busy, and the leaders appeared confident. But peace under a dictator is like calm water before a storm. It hides what's coming. In secret, both regimes were preparing for war. They built weapons, trained soldiers, and made alliances. Propaganda taught citizens that sacrifice was noble and that conquest was destiny. And many people, tired of chaos and poverty, believed them. They thought obedience had finally brought peace. They didn't realize that it had only built a cage, one that would soon burst open into war. Life under fascism and Nazism was not filled only with fear. It was filled with confusion. People were told they were free while being watched. They were told they were happy while being silenced. They were told they were safe while their neighbors disappeared. Propaganda gave them pride. Control gave them order. Fear kept them quiet. But beneath it all, humanity was shrinking, replaced by obedience and blind faith. As we move into the final chapter, we will see how these two powerful dictators, Hitler and Mussolini, carried their dreams of empire beyond their borders, how their hunger for domination turned Europe and the entire world toward a second, even greater war. By the late 1930s, the world was holding its breath. Europe looked peaceful on the surface. Cities were rebuilt, factories were busy, and the people seemed proud again. But underneath that calm, something dark was moving. Two dictators, Benito Mussolini in Italy and Adolf Hitler in Germany, were dreaming of empires, conquest, and revenge. And soon, their dreams would turn into war. This is the story of how the world slid, step by step, into the most destructive conflict in human history. Both Hitler and Mussolini wanted to make their nations great again. They spoke endlessly about glory, destiny, and strength. But greatness, to them, meant control over others. Mussolini wanted to rebuild the ancient Roman Empire. He told Italians they were born to rule the Mediterranean. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia, one of the few free African nations left. The war was brutal. Italian forces used bombs and even poisonous gas against villages. The League of Nations, the international organization meant to keep peace, protested, but did nothing serious to stop him. Mussolini learned a powerful lesson. The world is afraid to act. Hitler watched closely and took notes. In Germany, Hitler was moving faster. When he came to power in 1933, the Treaty of Versailles still limited his army to 100,000 men,
and banned tanks, planes, and submarines. But Hitler ignored the rules. He secretly rebuilt the military, trained soldiers, and produced weapons. In 1935, he announced that Germany was reintroducing conscription, forcing men to join the army again. The world complained, but once again, no one stopped him. The same year, British and French leaders met with him, and instead of punishing him, they signed agreements hoping to keep the peace. To Hitler, this was a sign of weakness. The next year, in 1936, he took his boldest step yet. He sent German troops into the Rhineland, a region that the Treaty of Versailles had declared demilitarized. This was forbidden, but again, no one acted. France and Britain, still haunted by the memory of World War I, did not want another war. When the soldiers marched into the Rhineland, Hitler was nervous. He told his generals that if the French army resisted, they would retreat immediately. But no one resisted. Crowds cheered, and the world remained silent. It was then that Hitler realized he could do almost anything. As Germany grew bolder, alliances began to form. In 1936, Hitler and Mussolini signed an agreement they called the Rome-Berlin Axis, meaning the world would now revolve around their two powers. Later, Japan joined them, creating the Axis powers. All three shared the same vision: expansion, military strength, and total control. In Spain, a civil war broke out between democracy and dictatorship. Hitler and Mussolini both sent soldiers, planes, and weapons to help the fascist general Francisco Franco, who later became Spain's dictator. This was not just a war, it was a training ground. German planes bombed Spanish towns, testing the weapons that would later be used in World War II. The most famous bombing was on the town of Guernica, which inspired a haunting painting by the artist Pablo Picasso, showing the pain and fear of civilians caught in war. While Hitler and Mussolini grew stronger, the rest of Europe hoped to avoid conflict. Britain and France followed a policy called appeasement, giving dictators what they wanted in the hope they would stop asking for more. It was like giving a wolf one piece of meat and hoping it would not come back hungry. In 1938, Hitler made his next move. He demanded that Austria, his home country, join Germany. He said Austrians and Germans were one people and should be united. When Austrian leaders hesitated, Hitler sent in troops and was welcomed with cheers. The union of Germany and Austria was called the Anschluss. Once again, the world did nothing. Hitler's confidence grew. Now he wanted more. After Austria, Hitler turned to Czechoslovakia, a small democratic country that bordered Germany. He claimed that the western region, called the Sudetenland, should belong to Germany because many people there spoke German. Czechoslovakia refused. So Hitler began to threaten war. Europe panicked. No one wanted another world war. In September 1938, leaders from Britain, France, Italy, and Germany met in Munich to find a solution. The Czech government was not even invited to the meeting. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, believed he could make peace by giving Hitler what he wanted. So they signed the Munich Agreement, allowing Hitler to take the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise that he would make no further demands. When Chamberlain returned to London, he waved the signed paper and declared, "I believe it is peace for our time." But it was not peace. It was surrender. Within months, Hitler broke his promise. In March 1939, he invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia and took it by force. Now, it was clear. Hitler did not want peace, but power. Seeing Hitler's success, Mussolini decided to expand too. He invaded Albania in 1939, claiming it as part of Italy's growing empire.
He wanted to show that Italy, like Germany, could dominate Europe. Together, the two dictators dreamed of a new world, one led by the Axis powers, stretching from Europe to Africa and beyond. The world was beginning to wake up, but too late. Hitler's next target was Poland, but attacking Poland could bring war with Britain and France, who had promised to protect it. So Hitler made a shocking deal, not with Italy, but with his enemy, the Soviet Union. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It was a secret agreement to divide Poland and Eastern Europe between them. The two countries promised not to attack each other. For the rest of the world, it was unbelievable. The Nazi dictator and the communist leader Joseph Stalin were now allies. The pact cleared Hitler's path to war. On the morning of September 1, 1939, the world changed forever. German tanks rolled across the Polish border. Planes bombed cities. Soldiers marched through towns with lightning speed. Hitler called it Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war. It was fast, brutal, and overwhelming. Poland's defenses collapsed within weeks. Britain and France, realizing appeasement had failed, finally acted. On September 3, 1939, they declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. Poland fought bravely, but it was no match for the German war machine. And soon, from the east, Soviet troops invaded too, as agreed in the secret pact. Poland was divided between the two powers. Within weeks, Europe was once again plunged into a war that would grow even larger than the last one. While bombs fell and borders changed, ordinary people faced terror. Families fled, children hid, and soldiers marched toward a future no one could predict. At first, Mussolini stayed cautious. He waited to see how the war would go. When Hitler's armies began to conquer country after country, Norway, Denmark, France, Belgium, Mussolini decided it was time to act. In June 1940, Italy declared war on Britain and France. Mussolini wanted a share of the victory. He dreamed of conquering parts of Africa and the Mediterranean. But Italy's army was poorly prepared. Many Italian soldiers didn't even know why they were fighting. Their invasions of Greece and North Africa quickly turned into disasters. Mussolini had wanted glory, but he had tied Italy's fate to Hitler's ambition. By 1940, the pattern was clear. Fascism and Nazism had turned Europe into a battlefield. Dictators who had promised order brought chaos. Men who said they would restore pride brought destruction. People who wanted peace were now hiding in basements as bombs fell from the sky. The world had failed to stop them when there was still time. Appeasement had not prevented war, it had only delayed it. It's easy to wonder, why didn't anyone stop Hitler earlier? The truth is complicated. After World War I, the world was tired of fighting. Millions had died in the trenches, and no one wanted that again. So leaders tried to keep peace through compromise, hoping that reason could control madness. They also underestimated how far dictators would go. They thought Hitler and Mussolini were just politicians, seeking fairness, not men preparing for conquest. And finally, the Great Depression had weakened nations. Economies were poor, and governments were divided. People focused on their own problems, while Europe slowly drifted toward disaster. By the time the danger was clear, it was too late. The rise of fascism and Nazism had begun as a promise of stability, pride, and strength. But by 1939, that promise had collapsed into war, cruelty, and destruction. The dictators who spoke of unity divided the world. The regimes that praised order brought terror. The movements that promised greatness led their nations into ruin. But at the time, millions still believed. They still marched in parades, waved flags, and sang songs, not knowing the storm that was about to destroy their world. As we look back, the story of the 1920s and 1930s teaches us something important, something timeless. It shows that fear can blind people, that pride can be twisted into hatred, that silence can be as dangerous as violence. and that when people stop questioning power, power grows without limit. The rise of fascism and Nazism had begun as a promise of stability, pride, and strength. But by 1939, that promise had collapsed into war, cruelty, and destruction. The dictators who spoke of unity divided the world. The regimes that praised order brought terror. The movements that promised greatness led their nations into ruin. But at the time, millions still believed. They still marched in parades, waved flags, and sang songs, not knowing the storm that was about to destroy their world. As we look back, the story of the 1920s and 1930s teaches us something important, something timeless. It shows that fear can blind people, that pride can be twisted into hatred, that silence can be as dangerous as violence, and that when people stop questioning power, power grows without limit. The rise of fascism and Nazism had begun as a promise of stability, pride, and strength. But by 1939, that promise had collapsed into war, cruelty, and destruction. The dictators who spoke of unity divided the world. The regimes that praised order brought terror. The movements that promised greatness led their nations into ruin. But at the time, millions still believed. They still marched in parades, waved flags, and sang songs, not knowing the storm that was about to destroy their world. When World War II began, it was not simply a battle of armies, it was a battle of ideas. On one side stood tyranny, control, and fear. On the other stood freedom, justice, and truth. The rise of fascism and Nazism had brought the world to the edge of darkness. But from that darkness, humanity would learn hard lessons. When the war finally ended, years later, tens of millions were dead. Cities were reduced to ashes, and the world had changed forever. But the memory of how it began, with anger, with fear, with silence, remains a warning for all generations to come. Because dictators do not rise in one day. They rise slowly, in the spaces where truth grows quiet and courage disappears. And so, as history whispers its lesson, we must remember: the price of peace is never forgetfulness. The defense of freedom is never silence.